The Belt and Road Initiative and its impact in Latin America. Hello, I'm Arnold Naidu and this is The Heat. As China marks the 10th anniversary of its massive Belt and Road Initiative, more and more countries across Latin America and the Caribbean have signed on to the BRI project. That is having a major impact in the region from everything from exports to investment and infrastructure. One example is the huge Chinese-backed port now under construction in Peru. We begin with this report from CGTN's Dan Collins.
Building a future as an export hub for South America. A huge initial investment of $3.6 billion is being made into the Chancay megaport. Its backers say the pier and a tunnel for trucks carrying containers will soon become part of a trade hub, opening the door to the Asian marketplace.
The
opportunity that this port gives and the window of opportunity that it opens for Brazil to go to the Pacific through here is enormous. Brazil's production, Brazil's exports, and the fact that part of it is coming here means that there will be a demand for labor services, and that is what Peru needs.
The megaport, part of China's Belt and Road Initiative, is a private joint venture between Chinese state-owned conglomerate COSCO Shipping Ports Limited, with 60% of the shares, and the Peruvian mining company Volcan with 40%. Still under construction, the Chancay megaport is projected as being South America's gateway to Asia. Just north of the Peruvian capital, Lima, the eventual deepwater port is expected to be able to offer a huge reduction in travel time across the Pacific Ocean. A journey that often takes 45 days may be cut to around 2 weeks once the port is operational. Its builders also claim it will be the first South American port to have the capacity to receive bigger ships with 18,000 containers in full load. As Peru's economy grows below expectations amid lower investment in mining following anti-government protests earlier this year, the port is being seen as a lifeline for flagging growth. Peruvian government hopes Chancay will become the primary hub for maritime trade between China and South America.
We're going to create an export platform, and the advantage of having the Chancay port is that it will allow us to have a more direct connection with China. So what we hope, and what the specialists say, is that a lot of maritime trade will be transferred and will start to be done through Peru.
In the big picture, China's maritime Silk Road will soon span the Pacific. A direct sea route connecting Chancay with China, Peru's largest trading partner, could help revive this country's sagging economy, once one of the fastest growing in Latin America. Dan Collins, CGTN, Chancay, Peru.
We have a lot to discuss, and joining me now from Boston is Jorge Heine. He is a former Chilean ambassador to China. Also with us from Beijing is Einar Tangen. He is a senior fellow with the Taihe Institute and the founder and chair of Asian Narratives. Joining the discussion from Sao Paulo is Gustavo Ribeiro. He is the founder and editor-in-chief of the Brazilian Report. And with us too from Oregon is Liang. She is chair professor in economics at Willamette University. Welcome to all of you. Ambassador Heine, let me start with you. Now, there are more than 20 Latin American and Caribbean countries that have joined China's Belt and Road Initiative. So, as we mark this 10th anniversary of the BRI, put this all into context for us. How significant is it for the economies in this region, for their growth, for their expansion?
It is very significant. First of all, from a conceptual point of view, what the BRI has done, it has put forth a different concept of what development is all about. It says that infrastructure and connectivity, both physical and digital, is very important for development. That it has worked for China and that it may very well work for the rest of the global south. And that is very different from the traditional developmentalist approach that's been promoted by the Bretton Woods institution. So that's number one. Number two, it responds to a very real need in Latin America. Latin America has one of the lowest investment rates in the world in infrastructure, only sub-Saharan Africa invests less and marginally so. So this means our competitiveness is very seriously affected by the high costs in logistics and transport. So these ports, these highways, railway projects come in very handy. And third, I will say this. What is very interesting is that now, suddenly, 10 years into it, the narrative around the world has changed on the BRI. There were a lot of criticism at the beginning, saying this was unnecessary, that it was dead diplomacy, that this was the building of white elephants, and so on and so forth. But now, Western countries, the G7, the US, Europe, they have come up with their own infrastructure projects. You know the phrase, imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. So we're seeing that. So it seems that BRI was onto something after all.
So, Ambassador, as you say, there was low investment in infrastructure in the region, in Latin America, and this, of course, made it very difficult for countries in the region to be competitive on world markets, in world trade. So now that this is taking place, now that the BRI is rolling out in many countries in Latin America, do you see a significant increase in the competitive power of the countries there?
Well, obviously, these things take their time. This is not something that happens from one day to the next. But the important thing is that a port like Chancay is being built and will soon open up for business. And, you know, we have projects in Panama, there are highways and ports in Chile, many other projects around the region. So the main thing here is to move in the right direction. And the results will show themselves over time. But it is very important to do so. Infrastructure projects take the time, but they pay off.
Liang, I was looking at some numbers, and we see that economic and trade exchanges between China and Latin America, they've soared. They really have soared, 40-fold since the year 2000, and the total trade volume in 2022 was $485 billion. How important is the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, for China's outreach to the global south? It's one of its signature initiatives in its relationship with fellow countries in the global south.
Right. Good to talk to you, Anand. So I think you're right. You know, the BRI project is all about connectivity, building infrastructures like ports, roads, highways, railways, and so on to promote a kind of connectivity. So China believes in moving cooperation. So they're investing in infrastructure in Latin American and Caribbean countries, or LACs, and trying to promote trade between the two parties, the two sides. So right now, I think a lot of countries in LACs are exporting iron ore, copper, oil, and soy, and other agriculture products to China. But at the same time, they're trying to upgrade their infrastructure, their supply chain, their value-added activities, and trying to promote more industrial and technological products. China also has just recently concluded, you know, free trade agreements with Ecuador. So I think there are a lot more fruitful kind of trade relationships going on between China and LAC countries. Now, the BRI also turned into a second phase. I think, you know, a lot of the borrowing countries are running out of their borrowing capacities, and they're also more you know, vigilant in terms of what they can finance and what they may have difficulties of doing. So we have seen the debt crisis in Argentina and Ecuador and, you know, Suriname. So I think, you know, but now a lot of the investments are in green technologies, in renewable energies, in telecommunications, and also in the EV supply chains. So we're going to see a BRI 2.0 that is going to continue to really promote economic connectivities and also economic development in the LACs and China.
Gustavo, we just heard about this major port being constructed in Peru, but as many of the people in that report at the beginning of the show told us, this is not just a port that's going to be of benefit to Peru. It's going to be, as we heard, a primary hub. It's going to be a platform for the entire region. And China has been Brazil's top trading partner for 14 straight years. It's a major exporter of beef, of soybeans, and crude. So what are the opportunities that a project like this present to Brazil?
Thanks for having me back. Actually, this port could be a game changer for producers of beef and grains in center-western Brazil and in the south of the Amazon. These are regions closer to Peru and Bolivia rather than the port of Santos, which is Brazil's main exporting port. So it will, these regions that are today located about 2,400 kilometers from the port of Santos will have a closer gateway. And it's important to remember that China accounts for 30% of Brazil's exports, and 44% of these exports are soybeans. So this is the center-western region. The south of the Amazon is a major soy producing region. It's Brazil's soy belt. So it will, it is possibly a game changer for this region because it will lower costs. It will make Brazilian products more competitive in global trade.
Einar Tangen, Argentina joined the Belt and Road Initiative just a year ago. This is the country's Vice Foreign Minister speaking about that. Let's listen.
I think that it is important, particularly when we talk about what has been called now the Global South, which is basically countries that see economic relations from a different point of view and basically take into account the need for both countries to profit and have a positive outcome of these relations, which means that infrastructure projects of China, we hope, will help us have our own jobs, our own creations by the time that the Chinese also receive that same thing.
So, Einar, we heard the minister there talk about how the Global South can work together, can cooperate to benefit from these China infrastructure products. But I want to ask you about this model because it's based on cooperation and mutual benefit. In fact, the ambassador alluded to that a moment ago. It's a marked difference from the U.S. model, isn't it?
Yeah, the Bretton Woods apparatus really didn't serve South America, at least in terms of the outcomes and things like this. And you saw, especially the last 20 years, a drop-off of interest by the U.S. in South America. And South America has been, or Latin America, I should say, has been interested in how it's going to go forward. China stepped up. Remember, this was not an area that was traditionally part of the Silk Road, but I think China was actually quite surprised by the fact that they were welcomed with open arms, and initially by Panama, which is always considered, it still is very, very close to the United States, but there is this overwhelming need that was not being addressed. So at this point, initially there were a lot of loans from country to country. Unfortunately, that is not a good political solution because every time the parties change in a democracy, there's a tendency to blame or say whatever the previous government did was wrong. So any loans that they took, obviously the new party coming in denounces them. Now you see it moving to a project-by-project basis. It's a lot of it is based on revenues. When will the project pay back, etc. A much more traditional approach. But along with that, I mean, this whole new port is a game changer. Traditionally, Latin America has been divided by the mountains, going down its spine, and it's been very difficult to get things across. This really does change all that. It's much more efficient, and these are the types of things that can really, really make a huge amount of change coming to Latin American countries, and giving them the confidence to know that they can do things. I mean, if you start looking at the pattern of Chinese investment, you'll see a tremendous amount of it is in ports, trade infrastructure, but also in providing electricity. For instance, Argentina, there's a nuclear project as well as 2 hydro projects. These are extremely important to a country that wants to make the transition from agricultural to more manufacturing.
Ambassador, we've just been hearing about how much of a game changer this port will be for Peru and for the region. But if we look more broadly in Latin America, I mean, how transformative has the Belt and Road Initiative been? I mean, you take Chile, for example. It's a major producer of lithium. 85% of its output actually goes to China, where it's used in the manufacture of electric vehicle batteries. And as we are all aware, China is now the world's biggest producer of these types of vehicles. So how important is the relationship?
Well, it is very important. But before going into that, let me add a footnote. to what my good friend Einar just said. And not only was BRI welcome in Latin America, I would take it one step further. In fact, as you may recall, BRI originally did not contemplate Latin America. There was talk about the new Silk Road that would connect East Asia with Europe, but Latin America was not part of it. But Latin America became interested in it. It is not a coincidence. The first head of state to visit the Asian Investment and Infrastructure Bank was President Michelle Bachelet of Chile. It's not a coincidence that she was also one of the opening speakers at the first BRI International Cooperation Forum in May of 2017 in Beijing. So it is important to understand that the presence of BRI in Latin America is not simply a Chinese initiative. It is also due to Latin America's interest in it. So that the footnote. And then on obviously the relationship of Chile with China is extremely important. We all are looking forward to the visit by President Boric to China now in October. He will attend the third BRI International Cooperation Forum, and then will make a state visit to China. And we much hope that that will contribute to cement further the relationship. A reference was made to how much Brazil exports to China. In the case of Chile, 40% of Chile's exports go to China. We're talking about $65 billion in bilateral trade. So an enormous amount of trade, also significant investment. There have been years in the recent past in which China has been the #1 investor in Chile. So it's a very strong relationship.
Gustavo, as the ambassador just told us, initially the BRI was not supposed to be, at least Latin America was not supposed to be part of the BRI, which was seen as the Silk Road initiative. But once China reached out to Latin America embraced the concept. So what does that tell us? That there was a serious need 10 years ago and before that, of course, for the kind of projects that China is engaged in right now?
Well, there is this major need. Infrastructure is probably the biggest bottleneck we have here in Latin America. In the case of Brazil, Brazil is not a part of the BRI. Some advisors in President Lula's government believe that we should be a part of the initiative. Others say that actually that's not necessarily a need for Brazil, because Brazil's economy is already incredibly intertwined with China's. 27% of our imports come from China. Like I said before, 30% of our exports go there. China is one of the main sources of FDI in Brazil. Brazil was actually the biggest destination of China's investment in 2021. And last year we saw a record number of new infrastructure projects, 32 projects from China coming to Brazil. And these projects have shifted a lot. They have shifted from fossil fuel energy to green energy. So we are seeing that China is playing a big role in Brazil in terms of allowing Brazil to get investments for much needed infrastructure, to move goods, to connect different hubs in the country. And that's certainly something that this new leftist government that we have in Brazil is keen on improving, this relationship that we have with China.
Liang, China is already the largest trading partner for something like 9 countries in the region. Those countries include Brazil, include Peru, include Venezuela. Brazil, of course, as we were just reminded, is not yet a member of BRI. It might join at some point in the future. But what are your expectations for the future? Where do you see the potential for expansion?
Right. So I think, again, the emphasis is on the win-win cooperation. I think, Latin American countries will often consider a place where they simply export primary commodities, including, some of the critical minerals. But I think China's role here is not only to secure its own needs for, raw materials like lithium or copper core ore, but more importantly, I think China is really bringing technologies, bringing investments, bringing in infrastructure to these countries to help their own development development. So one example is Bolivia just secured a $1 billion sort of deal with China to engage in sort of lithium development. So this is one of the lithium triangle countries. So a lot of people are skeptical. Again, this is sort of a resource grab. But no, this $1 billion trade deal or investment deal includes a deal to build road transportation and other forms of transportation in terms of infrastructure, but also to build 2 factories that will help to produce battery grade the lithium carbonate. So I think what this shows is that China is helping these countries to upgrade their own industrial supply chain to gain more value added from their exports, from their investments. And I think that is very important, not only for these countries' own technological future, but also for that renewable, sort of greener industries, greener technologies in the future. Not to mention, China also helped to build, Argentina's, the solar park, and also Honduras's hydroelectric dam. So I think there are a lot of win-win cooperation in the sense that this is all about sustainable development rather than, just going to the countries to serve their own interests.
I want to get your view on something that Jan Liang mentioned a moment ago, and that is, critics of the BRI say, well, look, it's a resource grab by China, and China is landing many of these countries in debt. It's been referred to as the debt trap. How does China respond to that?
Well, you've already heard a number of responses to that. I mean, there is no way to go forward if you do not have investment in your infrastructure. China's doing that. And I think a lot of the debt trap talk is really just about geopolitical issues. I mean, the Monroe Doctrine, espoused by the U.S., basically said South America is ours. And, China's entry into there was not opposed by the U.S. That was quite interesting. They just seemed to ignore it. But now it's making huge inroads. A lot of the pieces are coming together. Now, remember, the Belt and Road Initiative is not one project. It's projects that are linking these together. So if you say there's a port, well, the question is what's coming in and out of that port. And that's the most important part of it. And as I said earlier, there's been a sea change in the way that China invests through its Belt and Road Initiative. No longer is it government-to-government loans. There might be aid, but not so much loans. It's more about project loans, which are looked at in terms of their economic feasibility. And this is making huge changes. So, when you hear this stuff about debt trap diplomacy, you have to take it with a grain of salt or a large mountain of salt, because it seems just to be about bad regrets about not having done something similar themselves. Right now, Latin American countries have an alternative to the dominance of the United States. And as we can see, they're anxious to take it.
Ambassador, what do you make of, there's increasing talk about the geopolitics of China's increasing role in Latin America? Are we going to see pushback from the United States?
Well, we are seeing some pushback from the United States, naturally, but without much effect, among other things, because the United States doesn't have many tools with which to counter it. The United States right now is not providing market access to Latin American countries that do not have free trade agreements with it. Ecuador is the most dramatic example. Ecuador wanted to sign a negotiate a free trade agreement with the United States, but was told in no uncertain terms that the United States is no longer signing free trade agreements. So Ecuador went to Beijing and negotiated and signed one, as was earlier mentioned. So that's one thing. And there aren't a whole lot of resources in the United States now to allocate to Latin America. So the United States, in that sense, is caught in a bit of a bind.
Jan Liang, the Uruguayan Minister of Trade, he's been talking about cooperation between China and Uruguay, especially in the fields of technology. What kind of impact will Chinese technology, the development of Chinese technology, have in the region? Could we see more bilateral cooperation on things like research and development?
Right. So I think there are at least three major areas where we can see technological cooperations between China and LACs. So one of them, of course, is again renewable energies, and there are a lot of research and development that could go into, how do we manufacture and mass manufacture this sort of renewable energies for more sustainable future. And second is the supply chain for EVs. And again, Latin American countries are resources rich, and China does have the interest of establishing more EV productions in the Latin American countries. So I think that definitely is a good place for cooperation. And finally, I think telecommunications. Huawei has been investing heavily in the past 20 years and has established, over, I think 9 data centers. They're also rolling out a lot more, sort of infrastructure for 5G. So I think that is also a fruitful areas for development. But one thing I think is very important is I think from what we have heard so far among all the panelists is that these countries, Latin American countries as the recipient countries, they really need to take agencies. I think they are doing so. They're really thinking what is good for themselves, what is strategically important for them to invest in, what kind of technology they want to obtain, and what kind of technologies they wanted to, develop. So I think that is very important. It takes two to tango. I think China is willing to, foster that win-win cooperation, but I think also Latin American countries need to do their own homework and try to negotiate and try to, get the best deal for themselves.
Gustavo, talking about technology, of course, China is a world leader in the development of 5G technology. What's the potential there for cooperation with Brazil to develop these technologies even further?
Well, Brazil, when it auctioned its 5G frequencies, actually did not allow Huawei to enter government networks, but did allow Huawei to operate private networks. And most antennas in Brazil, telecom antennas in Brazil, are operated and owned by Huawei. So Huawei will be necessarily a big player in 5G technology in Brazil. Just to add to a point about EV technology, in Brazil, for instance, EVs are still very marginal, but what we have seen in terms of local production of EVs have come from Chinese companies. BYD is about to set a plant in Brazil, Great Wall Motors as well, and the Chinese companies are the ones trying to tap into this massive potential that we have and that Western companies have still massively overlooked.
Okay, and that is where we have to leave it. Thank you to all of you for being with us. I'm Einar Tangen in Washington, D.C. Thank you for watching.